speaker of the hour is Brother Michael Wyatt. Mike Wyatt has been preaching for the Adams Avenue Church of Christ in Lebanon, Tennessee for the past 5 years. He is a 1978 graduate of the Brown Trail School of Preaching and has worked full-time with this congregation in Texas, Louisiana, and Tennessee. He has worked on campus in Riga, Latvia, and worked on campaigns in Riga, Latvia, and Jamaica. He and Susie have 2 children and 5 grandchildren, all living in Tennessee. Michael Wyatt, Brother Michael, has the topic of the challenge to consider the consequences of our actions.
This morning I led the first song, and Brother Russ was sitting there next to me, and after we led the song and the prayer and I got ready to walk down, I said, all right, I woke them up, now you can put them to sleep. And Tony did the opposite. He pointed to me and said, well, I thought that song would wake them up. I said, well, I just told some back in the back they ought to stretch out and enjoy the little nap they might get here. But let's see what we can do with our lesson. One of the best weeks of the year is nearing an end. It's passed by so quickly. And each year, this is the best one. Couldn't get any better. And every year it's that way. And there's a reason for that. We're covering the greatest material you can cover, God's Word, but we have the best people. I mean, I've been to a lot of places, and there's none like this. And I tell everyone that, you ought to try to go up there. It's different than any others. It's like home. That's because of you, and we appreciate you. And the other congregations who are involved, we're always so thankful for this wonderful opportunity. And it's truly a great blessing this year for me because I've got my sweet Susie with me. She's retired now. She's been waiting to be the preacher's wife again and be on my arm and side by side, and that's the way it needs to be, and that's the way we both love it, and so we're thankful for that, and that she's been able to be here all week as well. Thank you again for this wonderful opportunity and being who you are. You're just lovely, wonderful, can't wait to be with you type people, and appreciate these kids sitting down here in the front. Boy, when they sing, they just light it up, and I love to see old people sing about heaven. I've often told them, you're nearer than you've ever been before, so you ought to really, put everything into it you can. But then when I think about hear these children singing about heaven, that's what it's got to be like, and can't wait. So in case something happens and we don't get to be together another year, we look forward to that time in heaven. For more than 5 decades, there was a popular entertainer, popular among masses, popular among many people, sorry reputation as far as I knew of, and as far as probably any Christian would think of. But for 5 decades, he was very popular by the name of Frank Sinatra. He was my mother-in-law's favorite. And we certainly knew that because after she passed away, we inherited the tapes. Of course, there's some of you young people who are thinking, Frank who? And not only that, you're thinking, tapes? What are you talking about? But anyway, he was best known, no doubt, for the song My Way. I can hear him, picture him in my mind and hear him singing that. But it struck a responsive chord among his fans. And what chord? What are you talking about? Self-will. That's the dominant desire of most human beings today, is to do things my own way, right? Even from the very beginning. In Genesis chapter 3, verses 5 through 6, remember Satan said, for God doth know that in the day you eat thereof, that your eyes will be opened, you shall be as gods, knowing good from evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and it was a tree desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And friends, that's exactly the way the end of the song is. I did it my way. You know, in the ordinary affairs of life, that idea of self-determination, that's a plus. You hear people saying, I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps. I took this that was nothing and I made something out of it. But you realize in our relationship to God, our way is never right. Our self-will must be subordinated to His will. And as Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but thine be done. Have you ever been in charge of a group of people going somewhere? Maybe you were the organizer, or you were the one getting things up. Maybe you were the one leading the way or something of that nature. And when you deal with people like that and you're the organizer or the leader, there's always complaints, aren't there? And then throw in, sometime along the way, you make a wrong decision. You go the wrong direction. Oops! Now you're dealing with the complaining and the wrong turns or decisions. And with all of those, there's always consequences. And most often not ones we want. There are consequences for everything we do. And that's exactly where we find ourselves in the lesson this afternoon. Moses had led the Israelites out of Egypt. They are now on their way to the promised land. They've seen the plagues brought upon the Egyptians for the release of the Israelites. They saw them. They also saw the parting of the Red Sea. They walked across on dry land. They had been given a cloud cover by day and a pillar of fire by night for their guidance and their protection. They were given food from heaven to sustain them, to feed them. God had done all of these miraculous things for them to say, I'm in control, I'm taking care of you. And now this group of people comes to Kadesh Barnea, Numbers chapter 13. Right there on the border, getting ready to enter the promised land. In Moses' own words, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 21. Behold, the Lord thy God has set the land before thee. Go up and possess it. As the Lord God of thy fathers has said unto thee, fear not, neither be discouraged. Now, when you read the account in Numbers chapter 13, people oftentimes say, they get up to Kadesh Barnea and God said, okay, I want you to send some spies in there first to spy out the land. That's not how it was. You got to read all the account of this. Yes, God said do that, but He allowed what they demanded to do. In Moses' own words, right there in Deuteronomy chapter 1, as it continues, he said, and ye came near unto me, every one of you, and said, we will send before us men before us, and they shall search out the land and bring us word again by what way we go up and into what cities we shall come. And God said, okay. It was their idea. It's what they demanded, and God allowed it. And Moses sends 12 men to the land to scope it out. These are the leaders of the tribes of Israel. Moses tells them, go check out the land. Go check out the cities. Go check out the crops. Go check out the people. Then return and give a report. And so they did that. It took 40 days. Here's what they found. The cities are fortified. They're walled. The land, it's rich and fertile. In Numbers 13 and verse 23, they gather up a cluster of grapes. A cluster of grapes. It took 2 of them to carry them. So big. And the people, they're many, and some of them are really big. They're giants. Well, after 40 days, they return, make their report to Moses. I picture everybody in camp is there to hear this report. They've been waiting for this. After all, this is a land God has given to us. We're ready to go in. This is going to be our home. And the report wasn't what they expected. Now, all of them agreed that the land was great, the crops were huge, They all agreed the cities would be tough to conquer. And there were some really big people there that lived there and would probably fight to keep the Israelites out. And here's where the rub came in. Two of them, Joshua and Caleb, they said, let's go up at once and take the land. We can take these people and God will fight for us. We can do this because God is leading us. But the 10 said, we can't do this. People are too big. And then notice their description of themselves. And there we saw the giants, Numbers 13:33. The sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, so we were in their sight. Well, we know the story. People took the advice of the 10, and because of that, there were consequences. God was displeased, and they spent 40 years, one for each day the spies were in the land, wandering around in the desert before they could finally enter into the promised land. Romans 15:4 says that's written for our learning. But what I've always gotten out of this story, this event that took place, is found in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7, which is our text of this lesson. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Because not one of the adults who believed the 10 were allowed to enter the promised land, just Joshua and Caleb. Remember when they numbered the fighting men, 20 years and above, were able to go out and fight. 605,550 fighting men numbered. How many of them went into the promised land? 2. 605,448 of them died and did not get to go in the land. Why? Because of consequences. Now we jump 40 years. The people have been wandering, and now they're back at Kadesh. And the promised land lies before them. And the people 40 years ago that were 20 years old and older, every one of them but those 2 have died in the wilderness. And so this is a brand new generation. Right here at Kadesh, right here where 40 years ago their parents stood ready to go in and didn't get to. So this is a new generation, stands at the boundary of the blessings that God has for them. Numbers chapter 20. And yet they complain. I don't know how many times lately I've been saying, I'm just like my dad. Well, Bub Wyatt, what are you doing? Doing just like, here they are. This new generation, they're thirsty. They're tired of manna. So they complain. Wonder where they learned that. They question Moses' leadership. They complain and complain. In fact, the text indicates there were 10 times in this whole journey that God became so angry at these people because of their complaining. And Moses takes this to God, and God hears Moses' plea about the complaining of the people. And so he tells Moses, they're thirsty, speak to this rock, and water will come forth to quench their thirst. I don't know. I wasn't there. I just know what the Bible tells us. What happened. Perhaps, just perhaps, Moses, it seems that 40 years of frustration finally gets the best of Moses. And instead of speaking to the rock like God said, he strikes the rock. Must we fetch you water? The water comes. But God is displeased because of Moses' disobedience. Instead of speaking to the rock, he struck the rock. And I never read that without thinking of, be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. But Moses, God is not mocked. It doesn't matter who you are. You're not going to mock God. You're not going to disobey God and think you can get by with it. Even Moses had the consequences. Neither he nor Aaron could enter into the promised land. You know, you'd think Aaron wouldn't be able to go because of what happened there at the golden calf. Remember that? I threw in this gold and out popped this calf. You wonder why Nadab and Abihu were as flippant to the worship of God. Where did they get that? Their father Aaron. Oh, I just threw this gold in and out popped this calf. Aaron shall be gathered unto his people, for he shall not enter into the land which I have given unto the children of Israel, because ye rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. Numbers 20 and verse 24. God is not mocked. Whatever you sow, that's what you're going to reap. Just before his death, Moses addresses the people one last time, and he leaves them with some very encouraging words found in the book of Deuteronomy, and we'll get to those in just a moment. But let's think about our lesson. The title of our lesson, The Challenge to Consider Consequences. Let's think about some points here as we think of our title and our text. Every choice you make is going to have consequences. Every choice. Now, there are good consequences and there are bad consequences, but every one of them has consequences. We can't get around that. At Kadesh, the people chose to follow the counsel of the 10 spies, and their fears were there consequences to that. You better believe it, because you don't mock God. There are consequences. 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. As a result of their lack of faith and disobedience, not one of those 20 years old and above would be allowed to enter the promised land except Joshua and Caleb. Their disobedience affected their children too. Think about those children. If they had children when those men went in to spy the land and came back with that evil report, they had children there. Those children for 40 years had to suffer that. And children who were born during that time, they all had to suffer because of the disobedience of those who followed those people. Why? Because you don't mock God, and people suffer consequences. When Moses struck the rock, you don't mock God. It doesn't matter who you are. Moses had to suffer the consequences. He could not enter into the promised land because no one is exempt from God's judgment. Even Moses was punished for his disobedience. And we hear the words in the New Testament, be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. You know, the majority do not always make the right decisions, and consequences will always be there. The 10 spies, they reported back out of their fears, and they stirred up all the people to follow their advice. There are consequences? Yeah, there are. Joshua and Caleb, while they're in the minority, they pointed to the right. That means the majority, all the rest of them, were going in the wrong direction. God had told them in Exodus chapter 23:2, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Here's one of those times. They certainly did that. And the words of Galatians 6 and verse 7 ring out, be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. You know, fear can paralyze us, keep us from experiencing what God has for us. I wonder how many things we have missed out on because of fears, because of following others. The fear of the 10 kept the Israelites from experiencing all the promised land, all that God had to offer for 40 years. In fact, that generation would never experience it. But they did experience the consequences of wandering in the wilderness. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. What was the spies' problem? What was the problem when they got over there and they saw the land great? The crops are huge. Yeah, the walls around the city and things like that. But those giants, if they would have had the proper perspective, if they'd have been looking to God like Joshua and Caleb, listen, the majority were saying they had problems with that because they couldn't see God for the giants. All they could see were the giants. Joshua and Caleb had no problem with the giants because all they could see was God. And there were consequences to that. We were as grasshoppers in our own eyes. I wonder today, are there fears that keep you from moving forward, following God's will, God's direction for our lives? If so, there's going to be consequences. Maybe it's because of a fear of failure. You think anybody's stopped, quit, not gone forward because of the fear of failure? You know there are. Maybe some of us. Maybe it's because of the unknown. I don't know. I'm afraid. I'm frightened. Is it the fear of what life may hold? Maybe survival itself. Or maybe it's just the fear of what are others going to think? Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. The ancient was telling the grandson, remember about the two wolves that live inside of every person. One devours and destroys, the other one protects. The grandchild said, "Grandfather, which one wins?" And the ancient said, "Whichever one you feed." You know, the consequences of disobedience brings judgment. As I said, Moses was punished for his disobedience. There's no entrance into the promised land. You've led these people all this time, but you're not going in because of your disobedience. He's reaping what he sowed. You know, it's not whether a person has more good deeds than bad deeds. Everybody thinks that. People out in the world think, well, somebody even preached about, I'm not really bad. I don't deserve hell. I'm not like some of these people because, my side of good leans more than my side of bad. I'm not a bad person. And that's not judgment. That's not what God is doing. You're either obedient to God or you're not, and you're going to have the consequences. Be not deceived. Disobedience always has consequences. God is not mocked. You're not going to fool God. God is truthful to His Word. It's always going to be exactly the way He said it's going to be. And you don't entertain any doubt it's not going to be that way. Well, I think God will, Let's look at Moses' farewell speech. God has told Moses, you're not going to enter the promised land. He's going to be allowed to see it. He's going to be able to climb up on that mountain and see it. And I don't know if it's just because Nebo was so tall or it was a vision from God that he was able to see. But he was able to see it, but he could not go in it. Knowing that he was going to die soon, there was a heavy burden on his heart. Listen, he had been leading these people. He loved these people. They were like his children. Yeah, they complained all the time, but he continued to lead them. He stuck up for them. God said, step aside. I'm going to destroy them all. And he pled for the people. And so naturally, his heart was for these people and his heavy burden on his heart for these people. He needed to impart wisdom to them. He needed to give them instruction to his children to pass Israel's history on to them so they wouldn't make those same mistakes that their fathers made. So Moses desperately needed to convey to them the work of God on their behalf. Here's what God has done for you. Here's what God is doing for you. It was always about God. Look what God is doing for you. He needed to get that across to them. He needed to encourage them to and their appropriate response to what God is doing. Trust and love and obedience. But as I read Moses' farewell address, it seems to be more and more about consequences, to warn them of consequences. You know, his message can be summarized this way: consequences. There's only one God, the Lord. He loved you. He redeemed you. Therefore, you believe and obey, or else. What's that? Consequences. Or else. Obedience from the heart. That will result in, what's that? Consequences. That will result in prosperity in the land. Loving God results in that's consequences. Loving God results in obedience, and obedience results in life. That's consequences. But you turn away from God, results in, what's that? Consequences. Disobedience, and disobedience results in death. And you will not live in the land. The Lord has set before you life and death. Good summary. Found in Deuteronomy 30:19. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that thou and thy household, thy seed may live. What is that? Consequences. Choose life. Consequences. You'll live. Disobedience. Choose that. Consequences. You'll die. Abundant blessings shall flow into your life, and it can all be determined by that great big word, if. To me, Deuteronomy 28 is all about that word, if. Deuteronomy 28. The whole chapter, but let's notice a few places. In verses 1 and 2. And it shall come to pass, if, and you might underline that in your Bible, circle it, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and do all His commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee, if, underline, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. Do you see it? Consequences. If you hearken, if you do, blessings will come your way. There's the consequences. I like those consequences. But then in verse 15, there's the dividing line in the chapter. Put a little line there. But if it shall come to pass, if, circle that, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all His commandments and His statutes which I command thee this day, that all these, underline, curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Cursed shall be thou in the city, cursed shall thou be in the field. You see it? It's all about consequences. If you don't hearken, if you will not do, consequences you can count on. How do you know you can count on it? Because God is not mocked. He said this is the way it's going to be. And it's not going to be any other way. Here are the consequences. Curses. In fact, everywhere in the Bible, you run across that great big word, if. Always watch for the consequences. Because they're always there. The challenge to consider consequences. What fears keep you from moving forward in fully obeying the Lord? Look what happened in that day. The majority came across and it was all about fear, and they followed that fear, and there were consequences. What disobedience needs to be confessed, forgiven, and covered for you to experience all the blessings God has for you? How sad. There's so many people who don't recognize all that God has for you because of your disobedience and your sin and the consequences of it. We used to have an award that we gave when we played softball. It was called the If Award. You know, especially if we lost the game, it was always, well, if I'd have done this, or usually if he'd have caught that ball or if he'd hit the ball, it was always if. You know, that's the way it is with a lot of us. If. Today, as you look at the life ahead, you need to choose to follow in faith because there are consequences. How do you know that, Mike? You don't mock God. God said, whatever you sow, that's what you're going to reap. And there are consequences for everything you do. If you listen and do, blessings. If you fail to listen, if you fail to do, not me. I'm fine. You know, one of the saddest things I have to deal with when someone usually comes and maybe they're, just off the street, comes up and asks for help and things of that nature, and I begin to talk with them, and it ends up studying. That's how that works. And oh yeah, I pray all the time. Well, where do you worship God? Well, I haven't been. Well, how do you live for Him? Well, I haven't been to realize what consequences are. The Bible makes it plain that if you're not a faithful child of God, He's not listening to your prayers. Listen, I call upon God because I'm searching for Him. I understand that. But a person who knows what God is saying and not doing it, there are consequences that you're not mocking God. He's not going to all of a sudden, well, I'm going to go ahead and listen to you. It don't matter what you do or don't do. I'm going to go ahead and listen. God doesn't even listen. Why? There are consequences. How do you know that? Because you don't mock God. God said, here's the way it is. And it's going to be exactly that way. And if you will listen and if you'll do, then you'll have blessings. If you don't listen, you don't do, the Bible says curses. Why? Because there are consequences. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. The challenge before us is to consider the consequences of all that we do. And if we'll make the right choices, God is going to bless us. That's the consequences. But if we don't, God is not mocked. Whatever you sow, that's what you'll reap. Thank you very much.